I don't remember deciding anything. That's the part people seem to expect. A moment, a door swinging open, a before and after. What I remember instead is smaller than that. A hallway mirror in my parents' house, the kind with a chip in the corner of the frame, and a 10-year-old version of me pausing in front of it longer than a boy was supposed to. It wasn't about clothes yet. It was about stillness. The rest of the house was loud in the particular way that houses get loud when nobody is shouting but everyone is tense. My father silences. My mother sighs that meant something specific only she understood, the television filling gaps that conversation should have filled. In front of that mirror, for 30 seconds at a time, none of that reached me. I would look at my own face and feel, briefly, like I belonged to myself instead of to the noise around me. I started borrowing small things. A scarf of my mother's, worn once around my neck on a day no one was home, then folded back exactly as I'd found it. A bracelet that wasn't even particularly feminine, just soft-looking, cool against my wrist. I didn't have language for what I was doing. I only knew that wearing something gentle made the day feel less like something happening to me and more like something I was quietly choosing how to meet. I want to be honest about how unremarkable this felt at the time. There was no swelling music, no sense of crossing a threshold. There was a boy who felt overwhelmed by ordinary things, a strict father, a school where he didn't fit the available categories, a body that already seemed to be asking questions he had no answers for, and there was a brief, private softness he could return the world's harshness with. That's all it was. A pressure valve with no name. I kept a small box under a loose floorboard, the kind of hiding place that exists in every house built before anyone thought to childproof against secrecy. In it, the scarf, a hair clip I'd found in a parking lot, a tube of lip balm tinted just barely pink, bought with allowance money and a story about it being for my mother. I didn't open the box often. Its existence was enough. Proof that some part of me had a place to go when the rest of me felt cornered. Looking back, I think what I was building, without knowing it, was a relationship with comfort that didn't depend on anyone else granting it to me. My father's moods were unpredictable. My friendships were thin and conditional, the kind boys have when they're all performing the same narrow idea of what a boy should be. But the box under the floorboard didn't have moods. It was simply there, waiting mine. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside. I had a family, a bed, food on the table, a bicycle I rode to school. By every visible measure, I was fine. But fine and understood are different things, and I didn't feel understood. Not by my parents, who loved me in a language I couldn't always translate, and not by myself, because I hadn't yet found the vocabulary for what I felt when I touched the soft edge of that scarf. I didn't cry about it. I want to resist the temptation to make this more dramatic than it was. Mostly I just noticed, the way you notice weather, that some days were heavier than others, and that on the heavy days, I gravitated toward the floorboard, toward the mirror, toward stillness. It was less an identity at that age than a coping mechanism without a name, something closer to comfort food than to selfhood. But comfort, repeated enough times, starts to lay down roots. And roots, given enough quiet years, start to grow into something with a shape of its own. By the time I was 12, the box had a few more items in it, each acquired the same careful way, each returned or hidden with the same caution. I didn't think of myself as hiding a secret so much as tending a small garden no one else needed to see. It would be years before I understood that the garden and I were, in some sense, the same thing. High school did what high school does to anyone who doesn't fit cleanly into its categories. It sharpened the edges. I became good at a particular kind of invisibility, present enough not to be singled out, quiet enough not to be tested. I had a small circle of friends who liked the version of me I showed them, which was real, just incomplete, like a photograph cropped to leave out the parts of the room that mattered most. The private rituals had grown more deliberate by then. I'd save money from odd jobs, mowing lawns, helping a neighbor with her garden, and use it carefully, never enough at once to be conspicuous. A soft sweater in a women's small, bought at a thrift store 2 towns over where no one knew my name. A bottle of nail polish in a shade so pale it was almost invisible, applied late at night and removed before morning, the ritual itself more important than the result. I wasn't performing femininity for anyone. I was rehearsing a version of comfort that the rest of my life didn't offer. I think this is the part of the story most people skip past too quickly, the part where it would be easy to call it a phase or a confusion, when really it was something more like self-care arriving in the only shape it knew how to take. I was anxious in those years, quietly, internally, the kind of anxiety that doesn't show up as panic, but as a constant low hum of bracing for the next demand, the next judgment, the next moment of having to be someone slightly different than I was. The ritual of softness, a scarf, a bit of color on my lips, the careful application of something gentle to a day that otherwise asked only for toughness, became the only reliable way I knew to lower that hum, even briefly. There was a particular evening, a Tuesday, nothing special about it except that everything had felt slightly too loud that week. A falling out with a friend, a disappointing grade, my father's voice carrying through the wall in that flat, disapproving register I'd learned to dread. I went to my room, locked the door, and for the first time put together something resembling a full outfit. The sweater, a skirt I'd hemmed myself with uneven stitches, the bracelet from years before. I stood in front of my mirror, a different mirror by then in a different house, and looked at myself for a long time. What I felt wasn't euphoria. I want to be precise about that because I think precision matters more than drama in a story like this. What I felt was relief. The specific, bodily relief of finally exhaling after holding your breath without realizing it. I looked like myself in a way I hadn't access to most days. Not a different person. Not a costume. Just myself, with the volume turned to a setting that finally matched what was happening inside. I started keeping a journal that year, hidden as carefully as the box had once been, where I wrote not about the clothes themselves, but about the feelings underneath them. I was trying to understand myself in writing, because I didn't yet trust myself to understand it out loud. I wrote about feeling like two people who weren't actually two people at all, just one person whose full shape didn't fit the narrow doorway the world had built for him. I wrote about wanting, more than anything, to stop performing relief and start actually feeling it all the time, without needing a locked door to access it. Looking back, I can see how much resilience was quietly being built in those years. Even though it didn't feel like resilience at the time, it felt like hiding. But hiding, when it's in service of self-preservation rather than self-erasure, is its own kind of strength. I was keeping something alive that the world around me hadn't yet made room for. I was learning, slowly and without a teacher, how to tend to my own weather instead of waiting for someone else to change the forecast. By the end of high school, I understood two things clearly, even if I couldn't yet say them aloud to another person, that the softness I returned to again and again wasn't a phase, and that the loneliness I felt wasn't going to be solved by hiding better. It was going to be solved, eventually, by finding a way to stop hiding at all. Adulthood arrived the way it does for most people, not as a single threshold, but as a long corridor of small adjustments. A job that paid the bills but didn't ask anything interesting of me. An apartment of my own, which mattered more than I expected, because for the first time the locked door wasn't a temporary refuge between other people's schedules. It was simply my door, all the time. I want to talk about the middle stretch of life honestly, because it's the part that gets skipped in most stories like this. The years that aren't a discovery and aren't a triumph, just a long, patient accumulation of small honesty. I didn't have a community. I didn't have language that felt entirely mine yet. What I had was time, privacy, and a willingness to keep asking the same quiet question. What does comfort actually look like for me today? The rituals changed shape during those years. They became less about secrecy and more about care. I learned how to apply makeup not as a disguise but as a kind of attention, the same attention you'd give to tending a plant or repairing something with your hands. I bought clothes that fit properly instead of clothes that merely passed unnoticed in a thrift store bag. I started in small ways to let the people closest to me see fragments of this, not dramatic reveals, just small honesties. A friend who noticed nail polish and didn't ask, just nodded. A coworker who complimented a soft cardigan I wore on casual Fridays, not knowing how much courage it had taken to wear it outside my apartment at all. Loneliness during this period took a different shape than it had in adolescence. It wasn't the loneliness of being misunderstood by people who loved me. It was the quieter loneliness of carrying something I hadn't yet learned to share. I'd come home from work, the kind of long day that leaves you feeling like a slightly worn-down version of yourself, and the ritual of changing, not into pajamas but into the soft, considered version of myself I kept for evenings alone, became less an escape and more a return. I wasn't leaving my day self behind. I was coming back to something more complete. I started to notice patterns in myself that I'd never had the stillness to observe before. The days I felt most anxious were the days I most craved the ritual. The days I felt most at peace were the days I'd already, without realizing it, integrated some small piece of that softness into how I moved through the world. A particular scent, a soft fabric under my work clothes, a private hour in the evening that belonged entirely to me. I began to understand that what I'd once thought of as an indulgence, something to be managed and hidden, was actually closer to a form of medicine. Not an escape from myself, but a treatment for the parts of myself that the world too often asked me to leave untreated. There's a particular kind of growth that doesn't announce itself. I didn't wake up one day and declare anything. Instead, I noticed gradually that I was speaking to myself more gently, in my own head, in the quiet narration that runs under every life. Where I had once thought this is strange, this is something to hide, I started thinking this is mine, and it's allowed to be mine. The shift wasn't loud. It was more like a tide changing direction by inches, so slowly that you only notice the new shoreline once you look back at where the water used to be. I started, around this time, to let go of an old assumption I hadn't examined closely enough, that self-acceptance was a single decision, made once and then simply held. It isn't. It's closer to a practice, something you return to, the way you return to any ritual of care, again and again, building trust in yourself one quiet evening at a time. I wasn't arriving at peace. I was practicing it the same way you practice anything you want to get better at. By the later years of that long middle stretch, the box under the floorboard, long gone, replaced by drawers I no longer needed to hide, had become almost a metaphor for how far I'd traveled. Not because the contents had changed so dramatically, but because the fear around them had quietly, steadily, worn away. There's a temptation in telling a story like this to locate a single turning point, a conversation, a decision, an event that changed everything. But the truer story is that there wasn't one. What there was, instead, was an accumulation of ordinary Tuesdays, each one slightly less guarded than the last, until one day I realized the guarding had mostly stopped without my noticing exactly when. I remember a particular morning, fairly recently, getting ready for an unremarkable day. Nothing special, no event to dress for, just life continuing as it does. I stood in front of my mirror, the way I had as a boy of 10, and noticed that the stillness I felt wasn't the stillness of escape anymore. It was simply the stillness of being present with myself. I wasn't borrowing comfort from a hidden box. I wasn't waiting for a locked door. I was just a person getting ready for a day, dressed in a way that matched who I actually was. It took me a long time to understand that the goal had never been to become someone else. The goal, all along, underneath the scarves and the lip balm and the carefully hemmed skirt and the quiet evenings of relief, had been to become more fully myself, to stop treating large parts of my own experience as contraband and start treating them as simply true. The years of private ritual hadn't been a rehearsal for some future transformation. They had been the transformation itself, happening so slowly and so gently that it never needed an audience to be real. I think often about the boy in that first hallway mirror, looking at himself longer than he was supposed to, with no language for what he wanted and no model for how to get it. I wish I could tell him that the softness he was reaching for wasn't a problem to be solved or a secret to be managed forever, that it was, in fact, the beginning of the most honest relationship he would ever have with himself. I wish I could tell him that the loneliness wouldn't last forever, not because the world would suddenly understand him, but because he would, eventually, stop needing the world's understanding as a precondition for his own peace. The emotional struggles that had once driven me toward the ritual, the anxiety, the sense of not fitting, the low hum of bracing for judgment, didn't disappear entirely. Life still has hard days. What changed was my relationship to them. I no longer needed the ritual to escape those days. I could simply meet them, dressed as myself, present in a way that didn't require hiding to feel safe. The comfort I'd once needed to steal in private moments had become, slowly, something I could carry with me into ordinary daylight. I think this is what resilience actually looks like in the end, not a single dramatic act of courage, but the quiet, repeated choice to keep tending to yourself even when no one is watching, until tending to yourself becomes simply how you live. I didn't become a different person. I became a more complete one, built slowly out of thousands of small, private decisions to treat my own comfort as something worth protecting. These days, the rituals are no longer rituals of secrecy. They are simply part of how I care for myself, the same way someone might tend a garden, or keep a regular practice of quiet reflection, or maintain any other habit that keeps a life in balance. Some mornings I dress with more softness than others. Some evenings I still set aside an hour that belongs only to me, not because I'm hiding anything, but because that hour has become a reliable source of steadiness, the way other people might rely on a walk outdoors or a cup of tea taken slowly. I've stopped waiting for a single moment of arrival, because I understand now that peace isn't a destination you reach and then simply inhabit forever. It's closer to the practice itself, the ongoing, gentle work of listening to what you need and giving it to yourself without shame. Some days that means dressing in a way that matches how I feel inside. Other days, it means simply being patient with the parts of myself still catching up to where the rest of me has already arrived. What I feel now, more than anything, is a kind of quiet gratitude for that 10-year-old in the hallway mirror. Not pity, not embarrassment, but gratitude for his instincts, for his quiet insistence on finding comfort even when he had no name for what he was doing. He didn't know he was building anything. He was just trying to get through a hard day. But he was, in fact, laying the first careful stones of a life that would eventually feel like home. I don't know that every life arrives at peace in the same way. Mine arrived slowly, through ordinary days and private rituals, through years of practicing gentleness toward myself long before I trusted anyone else with it. There was no single transformation, no dramatic unveiling, only a long, patient unfolding, each year a little less guarded than the last, until the guarding itself quietly fell away. If there's anything I'd want someone earlier in this journey to know, it's that the comfort you find in private, in the quiet hours when no one else is watching, isn't something to be ashamed of or rushed past. It might be the beginning of the most honest relationship you'll ever build with yourself. Mine was. And on this side of that long unfolding, what I feel isn't relief from hiding anymore. It's simply peace. Steady, unremarkable mine.